Thank you. Just give me a moment while I open this up. Good evening. I am going to try to speak in this. Maybe I should take it off. So I am so honored to be speaking to you as part of the Benjamin Ramirez-Arrosa lecture series. I'm grateful to President Ramon Sarda for the invitation. Also grateful to Dean Ronaldo Agranza-Mendez for organizing this opportunity, to the professors for kindly giving up your class time, valuable class time of teaching to let me make this address, and especially to the students who are spending your time here on this fine evening, listening to me rather than doing something else. I realize that although I've been teaching for 19 years in the law, probably the most important reason why I'm standing here today is because I am the granddaughter of Benjamin Ramirez-Arrosa and Evangeline Arrosa, who happen to be my grandparents and the founders of this institution. So I am especially grateful to you for giving me the privilege of making this talk in their honor. As I put this lecture together, I knew that I wanted to speak about dignity and the legal profession. But what I should say about it was not all that clear to me. And I've searched the internet quite a bit in the last couple of days to get some ideas and to try to crystallize my thoughts. And one of the internet pages that I found was on an organization called Global Dignity. And I was going to play you a little bit of their promo, but we can't set that up, so I won't do that. But what they do is, what they claim is their mission in life is to encourage people to be the best that they can and to help others do the same. And what they tend to do is organize global dignity days where on one day out of the year, several places all over the world will have a dignity day. And what they do on those dignity days is ask people to come up and tell their dignity stories. And people find whatever else they do that day to be incredibly moving and a wonderful learning experience, not only for the people who attend, for the students who attend, the adults who attend, but also for the people who actually put on who organize the activity. So one of the things, there's their mission. One of the things that they say on their webpage is this: in a world where it seems no one agrees on anything, a world where politics divides, religion divides, and race and even cultural borders seem to divide, dignity is something that everyone can agree on. Part of my lecture today will call that into question. Can we really all agree on what dignity means? And in the legal profession, do we really want to codify it as law? And if we do, what will it mean? So, because in the Global Dignity group, they suggest that the way we begin thinking about dignity is to tell our story, to tell our dignity story, I thought I would be guided by that and to tell you a little bit about myself. And I wish that it really were a little bit, but I have a feeling that it'll be longer than what I had originally planned, but bear with me. So I was born and raised in the United States, but I came here on several occasions as a child. And I have to say that this particular institution was very important in my mind and was really a core aspect of my identity. But when I came here as a child, I was much more influenced and interested in the life of my cousins. I was really struck by their life. And to be quite frank, I envied them tremendously. My cousins, Elizabeth and Minda Salabum, they could dance, They could play the piano. They were so graceful. They could speak Tagalog. On top of that, they were well behaved. They respected their elders. And that was in complete contrast to me and my brother and sister. We were seen as loud, unruly, a little bit obnoxious, and like, American brats. I also recall that my cousin George had, he was really young, but he had this great motorized car that he would drive around Vernon Park, and we just lusted after that car. And I have to say that 45 years later, envy dies very hard, and still today, I care a great deal about music, singing, dancing. Hold on a second. Oh, here we go. Dancing. I really wish I could dance with Fred Astaire. And I also still love the mini car, and my version of it is the Mini Cooper, which I have had a love affair with for the last 10 years as I've driven it around. But there was also another, more conflicted feeling I had about the Philippines. When I was young, my grandparents, whom I called Daddy Ben and Nana, had what we would call the big house, which is right across the street from Campo Filipino. And every time we came to visit, we stayed in the big house. And one day, and actually often, invariably, someone would come to the door, a woman in rags, and would just sit there. And I would be sitting in the living room, listening to the Man of La Mancha, which I had memorized, and kind of playing all the scenes of it in my head. And she would come and just sit and wait for someone to come. Wait for someone to give her food, wait for someone to give her money, or just wait. And sometimes someone would do that, and other times they wouldn't. Other times they would just shoo her away. And, even as a young child, I understood that maybe you did not want to give someone food and money every time they came because they would keep coming back. But I still felt incredibly uncomfortable, particularly when she just sat there. For me, it seemed like hours, until finally, she knew nothing would happen and she left. So that image stayed with me, and it was an image that I brought back to the United States. An image that I think I internalized on some level because it's so much a part of the Filipino culture, right? Just like tinikling and balut and jeepneys, begging is also part of the Filipino culture. And it was something that I internalized but did not know how to reconcile with my life. I know that it sounds really corny for someone from the U.S. to stand up here and describe a pivotal moment in their childhood as being one in which a beggar comes to her grandparents' home. And I agree, it's a bit corny and it might even be offensive. But what's less corny, I think, is the kind of ambiguous feeling that I internalized as a child. Because it really did make me wonder, well, what am I? Who am I? Am I Filipino? Am I American? What does it mean to be a Filipino-American in the United States? And is she really a part of me? If I'm Filipino, am I like her? It made me link my identity to poverty, to dirt, and even on some level to the shame around that. And yet, the paradox is that I so envied my Filipino cousins' life. The way they were being raised, the values they had, the fact that their families surrounded them, the fact that they knew who they were, and they knew that they belonged to the community in which they lived. In contrast, when I was growing up in the U.S., it was not so easy to know my place in the United States. We grew up in Texas in the 60s. We were the darkest people in our neighborhood. I looked at my parents and I thought they looked like they were white. So I was like, well, aren't they white too? But I was so dark, particularly in the summer. And it was a bit confusing. Was I Filipino? Was I African American? Was I Japanese? Was I Mexican? It was just a mix of an experience. And when we were younger, very young, my parents struggled financially. So we didn't get, to have piano lessons or dance lessons. But lest you feel sorry for me, it didn't last very long. And at some point we moved to New York by the time I was 10. I eventually got piano lessons and dance lessons. And there were a whole bunch of people in New York of all different colors and stripes. And so I felt much more comfortable. I got a great education. I ended up going to Yale University as an undergrad and to Columbia Law School as a law student. And both of those schools are Ivy League schools that are in the same league as Harvard, which I suspect many of you have heard. And so they were elite schools, just like Ateneo and LaSalle. And I had the benefit of going to those schools. And in attending those schools, many doors opened to me. The first door that I decided to walk through was into a high school that was really just about a few blocks away from Yale. And that high school was an inner city high school in New Haven called Hill House. It was 97% African American, and it truly was an inner city school. It was the hardest job I have ever had. My students had a completely different lifestyle than I did. I lived 4 years just a few blocks away, and I never knew that there was this completely different type of lifestyle right next door. They were worried about being shot at the time because there were a lot of drugs and gangs and shootings, drive-by shootings at night. A lot of the girls would get pregnant, so they worried about finishing high school, and a number of my students had to drop out because, in fact, they got pregnant. A lot of the students came in high, you know, on drugs. And I was so naive that I didn't know. And I didn't know until years later, like, why I could never understand what they wrote, you know, because they were high. And they didn't make any sense. So it was a complete contrast. It was kind of like flying halfway around the world, you know, to Asia, just a few blocks away. And it was really hard for me to understand how I could have gone to such an elite school and not have known that that lifestyle existed so close by. I only stayed there for a year. And after that, I actually hiked in Nepal for 3 months, which I loved doing. And then I came here and did an internship for a while before I went to law school. And I got to know the university, and I got to know my family a lot more. I then went to law school, and I have to say that it was not what I expected. And after my first year, I really considered quitting. It just was not, it was not a place where I found dignity at all. It was really stressful, and it just wasn't a great place. But in my first summer, after my first year, I got a human rights internship and came here and worked with FLAT, the Free Legal Assistance Bureau. And I don't know if you recall at the time, it was like 1989. And just 2 years before, Cory Aquino, President Aquino, had created this paramilitary group known as the CAF Group, the Citizens Armed Forces Geographical Unit. Is anyone familiar with the CAF Group? So the CAF Group were supposed to weed out all the insurgents in the villages and make sure that there weren't any, more uprisings. And they were supposed to protect the local people. But in fact, what people started saying is that they were committing a lot of human rights abuses. And so when I came here, I went down to Pagadian and did a fact-finding mission with some Jesuit priests and also some other human rights workers. And we interviewed local people who told us story after story after story of some of the abuses of the CAF group. It was incredibly moving to be face-to-face with people telling their stories. I was working with another intern, and in the second half of our internship, we went to Cebu and actually wrote something which was called a demur to evidence. I don't know what, to this day, what a demur to evidence is. I think you know much more what it is here than I do back in the US. But essentially what we were doing was writing, a whole bunch of people had been arrested and were claimed to be insurgents, and we began to write statements to show how the evidence did not suggest that they were insurgents. Even though we stayed in an office all day, and I didn't see any of Cebu, it was really worth it. Because a number of months later, while we were back in the US in law school, we got word that a number of those people were released because of the document that we had written. So that was a pivotal experience. That was transformative for me, and it made me go back to law school, you know, a little bit more on the mission, a little bit more dedicated to finishing it so that I could do some human rights work. After I graduated, I became a DA, a district attorney, and worked mainly in domestic violence. And then I got the job teaching at Boston College Law School. So, what has all that got to do with dignity? Well, let me give it a shot. So, as you know, I'm a prosecutor and a litigator, and I teach my students about how to put together a theory of case and to come up with a persuasive closing. And if any of you have watched, if you watch all these law shows like Law and Order and Ally McBeal, The Practice, I know I'm dating myself. I don't know what the shows are on now. Those are the shows I watch. Well, if you've seen any of that or if you practice law, you know that a prosecutor and a defense attorney can look at the same evidence and come up with a completely different argument based on the same evidence. So that's what I'll try to do here. Looking at the facts that I relate to you about my life, I could come up with one summary. The prosecutor might say this. So, who is Evangeline Sarda? Well, she started out as an unruly, loud, wild, and unspoiled American brat who envied her cousins and was never satisfied with what she had. And look at her now. Has she changed? The evidence suggests that she has not. She nagged her parents for piano lessons and dance lessons until she got them. She wanted her cousin's mini car, and so what did she do? She got a Mini Cooper, and she has 2 other cars besides that. She went to the best law school, the best schools in the country, but she still complains that she's a victim of racism. She's self-centered and self-indulgent and cares only about having unusual and exciting experiences, like hiking in Nepal and traveling around the Philippines, pretending to work, and forcing her family in the Philippines to give her a job. Goodness gracious, she even shut down the UC Law School so that everyone would be forced to listen to her. What do you call that? Privilege. Spoiled American brat. That works, right? All the facts that I've just stated to you are there, and you can make that argument. But one could also put together another argument that paints a different story. Your Honor, the defense for Evangeline Sarda. Evangeline Sarda's professional life has been a journey in search of the meaning of dignity. It's undeniable that she's privileged. She's had the privilege of a fine education, of landing a prestigious job, and the privilege of a loving and supportive family, a close-knit family that has given her everything she's wanted. But from a young age, she has struggled to reconcile the contradictory heritage, her contradictory heritage. The struggle led her to teach in a challenging inner-city school in the U.S., to go on a pilgrimage to Nepal, to meditate about her life, and to contribute to the mission and anchor her identity at the university that her grandparents built. Ultimately, it led her to pursue law in order to work for human rights and as a prosecutor in domestic violence. It has led her to create and teach courses like law, leadership, and social justice. Her search for meaning of the meaning of dignity applies not only to her clients and students that she has served, but to her own sense of her own self-worth and her own identity. And the journey continues at this very moment as she struggles to speak about the meaning of dignity in the legal profession. So that kind of works too, you know, it paints me in a little better light. But you can see that but I would argue that these two summaries about the meaning of one's life and one's work is indeed what is happening at any given moment. Because any given moment is never static. You can always make meaning, several meanings of any given moment. And in fact, that is what the law asks us to do. And I'm going to lose my notes. It asks us to put some facts together, to make meaning out of the facts before us, to take any moment or someone's story and to make meaning of it that will give them meaning. That is what the law asks us to do. And since I've lost my notes, I'm just going to start here. So I would like to now just take this moment and have you think about, well, what is the meaning of dignity? Think about examples in your own life and see if you can come up with a definition. I'm going to ask you just to spend a few minutes and turn to your neighbors and just talk, maybe about 3 to 5 minutes, and see if you can kind of come up with a definition of dignity. And then I'll see if anyone might be willing to share their definition with me. Okay? So go ahead. This definition also stated the state or quality of being worthy of honor or respect, a man of dignity and unbending principle. So that's what I found on the internet, but I have to say that that's not really satisfying to me. You know, dignity has to be more than really my own sense of my self-respect and my demeanor. So I looked up, I just typed in an example of dignity, and what I found on phanswers.yahoo.com was this. Someone actually posed the question, what is a good example of dignity and why? And here's one of the answers. Someone said, I saw an example of dignity at a homeless shelter that was feeding men. You know, because it's PH Yahoo, I'm thinking that this was in the Philippines. So anyway, a homeless shelter that was feeding men. One gentleman, yes, I use this word on purpose, who had nothing, was very polite with everyone. Volunteers and staff alike, and other homeless men alike. So again, that's a little bit about demeanor, right? He did not say his thank yous in a subservient or grudging way. He was not ashamed to be there, but grateful instead. He held his head up high and looked everyone in the eye and really thanked each volunteer and staff member from his heart. That's human dignity in action. So I feel a little more satisfied with this, but what are the characteristics that make this story about dignity? One was his manner in which he conducted himself. He wasn't subservient, not grudging, not ashamed. But that sounds a little bit like, you know, the earlier definition we had about someone's demeanor and the way they held themselves. His manner conveyed respect to others, and in respecting others, he also respected himself. But part of the dignity was in how he actually treated others. So that makes, you know, that's good. His worthiness had nothing to do with his status, his social status, his material wealth, or his role as a professional, because he was homeless. So his worthiness was just intrinsic, just an aspect of who he was as a human. And the story illustrates what it means to treat people with dignity. And essentially, I think from the story, one understands that treating people with respect is like treating them with dignity. And I think one of the reasons why I think this story makes us think it's a dignity story is because we think that the opposite is true. We think, in fact, that a lot of times homeless people do not have a lot of dignity. And that if you have a high rank, that you have dignity, that dignitaries have dignity, presidents have dignity, kings have dignity, aristocrats have dignity. In the past, in ancient times, that's in fact what dignity meant. It meant high social status or high rank, and that's why you call them dignitaries or aristocratic dignities. But this story suggests what the meaning of dignity is by our understanding of what indignity is. That homelessness feels like an indignity, but somehow he managed to hold himself with dignity. So that's one potential definition. One can also turn to religion for an exploration, a very rich explanation of dignity. On the website, I like websites, for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, this is a statement that you find: life and dignity of the human person. The Catholic Church proclaims that human life is sacred and that the dignity of the human person is the foundation of a moral vision for society. And indeed, Catholicism is one of the religions that has for a very long time considered and explored notions of dignity. On another Catholic social teaching webpage, which is run, I believe, by lay members, this is what they write: life and dignity of the human person. Human dignity is an equal value and worth given to us by God because he made us in God's image. And in fact, it's that piece that we are made in the image of God that gives us dignity. They go on that to say, here are some important things about human dignity. We don't share it. Each person, a person's dignity is not dependent on another person's. Everyone has equal value and worth. No one has more dignity or less dignity than the other person. Finally, human dignity is intrinsic. This means we don't earn human dignity, we just have it. It's a gift from God within us that we are given. Intrinsic means something is naturally within us, and it does not depend on what we do, who we are, how we live. It is just intrinsically a part of us as humans. So here we begin to see the definition promoted by religion begins to be something more than just demeanor. It's something that we hold inside, at least from a religious perspective, something that links us to God. That gives us dignity. These examples are helpful for thinking about the definition of dignity. And I think for the most part, I agree with these examples. And yet, I wonder, have you codified this into the law? And is it really possible to do so? So when I started researching dignity, I hadn't done a lot of research before I started preparing for this talk, I learned that in fact, debates regarding the meaning of dignity and its use in the legal context are raging. People don't agree. And in fact, I probably shouldn't say that they're raging. They're probably having quite dignified conversations and debates about dignity. Or perhaps, in fact, it really has everything to do with rage. Because at least on the legal front, the debate over the meaning and use of the concept of dignity it's intimately tied to the development of human rights. And for the most part, human rights grew out of the outrage of World War II and its atrocities. So some historians will argue that the history of dignity, which I alluded to before, begins with the use in ancient times related to high status. If you're an aristocrat, like I mentioned before, you had dignity. However, during the Enlightenment and the period after the French Revolution, which was about the turn of the 1800s, when the French revolted against both the clergy and the aristocracy, whom they resented because of their privileged life, particularly at a time when there was severe economic distress during that time, they abolished aristocratic dignities. And there was a kind of backlash toward the notion of dignity. People didn't like it because it was linked to the bearing and demeanor that was associated with aristocrats. So to put it simply in another way, dignity meant being a rich snob. So it kind of fell out of favor. But then it came back in the legal context first in 1848, when in a French document they abolished slavery. And they abolished slavery because it was incompatible with human dignity. They didn't say anything more than that. There was no other definition. But it was incompatible with human dignity. That is the first instance in modern time when dignity was found in a legal instrument. The second time it came up was with the Weimar Constitution, which was a constitution for Germany immediately after World War I. And in the Weimar Constitution, they based some notion about working that was based on the International Labor Organization's definition of working, that everyone had a right to a dignified workspace. That was the second time it was found. And here you can see exactly what it says. The economy has to be organized based on the principles of justice with the goal of achieving life and dignity for everyone. So here, dignity is linked to the ability to work. And that becomes a definition, a legal definition for what dignity means. That's the second time we see it. The third time we see it is in the Irish Constitution, where dignity appears in the preamble. And here's the preamble, but you can see where it's noted in yellow that the dignity and freedom of the individual should be assured by the Irish Constitution. So that's the third time that we see dignity. And then the fourth time we see it is in the German Basic Law, which was after World War II, when the Germans, it was their constitution after World War II, when they made dignity the most important basic right that they had. And they have they have a preamble, but you can see the very first basic right, Article 1, which is about human dignity, it's the first thing they say: human dignity shall be inviolable. And you can imagine that Germany was really cared a lot about this, particularly after World War II and all the atrocities that happened. But their German Basic Law was really based on a document that had been written the year before. And that was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was a resolution that was adopted by the very new United Nations. And this resolution signified, universal agreement that all human beings had basic rights, had human rights, and were entitled to dignity. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights gave birth to the International Human Rights Law. And here you can see in its preamble, it says at the very beginning, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is a foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. It goes on a little bit farther in the preamble to again talk about dignity. This section of the preamble just shows you that there was universal agreement about this notion of dignity. And then in the very first article, it states, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. So this is a very clear statement. Even though it doesn't really tell you what human dignity means, it clearly values human dignity. So this was wonderful. But the unfortunate thing was that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, although it had a great deal of moral force, it had no legal force. So no one could actually sue anyone, any state, for violating their dignity because it had no legal force. It wasn't until 2 additional covenants were ratified by the United Nations. And those covenants were the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. These were both ratified in 1976, and together with the Universal Declaration of Rights, these 3 instruments became formally known as the International Bill of Human Rights. This had the force of law, and once this was adopted, all of the nations that had agreed to adopt and ratify these conventions were now subject to the law, and individuals could actually sue their governments if their dignity was violated or their human rights were violated. So, as a result of these documents, widespread use of dignity began to be found in other nations' constitutions. I already talked about Ireland, I talked about Germany, Slovenia had it in its constitution, South Africa, Kenya, a number of states. Countries, including the Philippines, in its 1987 Constitution. In the Declaration of Principles, under its state policy, it says that it will be a state policy that the state values the dignity of every human person. In Article 13 on social justice and human rights, it also discusses how Congress will give the highest priority to the enactment of measures that protect and enhance the right of all people to human dignity. It later goes on in Section 1 to talk about human dignity. And then in subsequent Republic Acts, it also mentions human dignity. I'll just talk of 3. The Anti-Trafficking Act of 2003, the Anti-Violence Act Against Women and Their Children of 2004, and the Anti-Torture Act of 2009. All of these acts put dignity front and center. And it declares that the state values the dignity of every human person. And then it goes on to kind of put their own, anti-torture is slightly different from respecting women and children, etc. So I'll just go through that. Despite, however, the fact that you can find dignity now in all of these instruments, there is no consensus on what it actually means, unlike what global dignity suggested earlier, that there was actually consensus. There isn't much of a consensus. This is what global dignity said, remember. In a world where there is so much division, we all agree on dignity. But in fact, at least on a legal level, there is not a lot of agreement about dignity. I guess one of the that just means that there's a lot of confusion about dignity. The European Union Charter of Fundamental Rights, which had the force of law, starting in 2009. In its preamble, it talks about human dignity. And then in its very first chapter, it calls it dignity. Its very first article is entitled Human Dignity. Human dignity is inviolable. It must be respected and protected. That doesn't say much to us, that human dignity is inviolable. But the subsequent articles maybe give us a little of an idea of what they mean by dignity. It's the right to life, the right to the integrity of the person, both mental and physical, the prohibition of torture and inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment, and the prohibition of slavery and forced labor. So these 5 articles, one could argue, gives us some definition of what dignity means. Maybe it gives it a little flesh. But still, dignity isn't really defined, except that they state that it's inviolable. So even with this particular example, one feels that dignity is both more and less than the sum of these 5 articles. With this as a backdrop, lawyers all over the world have begun to use the concept of dignity to expand certain situations and certain rights. And it has become clear as these laws start getting developed, as cases are won based on dignity, that there are actually a lot of contradictions between the laws. So let me give you an example, a couple of examples. In Germany, the first modern constitution to mention dignity, the German Constitutional Court made the decision that the German military could not legally shoot down a passenger aircraft that was taken over by terrorists, even if they knew for sure that it would create a lot of destruction and a lot of death. The German court determined that the dignity of the passengers on the flight could not be violated, even though it, conflicted with all the other people on the ground and their right to life. They made the decision that you cannot violate dignity. In another kind of unusual case in France, there was this man named Mr. Wackenheim, and he was a dwarf. He chose to make his living by engaging in the sport of dwarf tossing. Dwarf tossing happened to be banned in the neighborhoods where he worked. So he filed a complaint, saying that I have a right to earn a living. That's my human dignity. But France and even the UN, so let me just say, and the UN, International Convention on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, the basis of international human rights law, Part 3, Article 6 states that state parties to the government recognize the right to work, which includes the right of everyone, the opportunity to gain his living by work which he freely chooses or accepts, and that states must appropriate steps to safeguard that right. So he argued vehemently, I have a right to be thrown as a dwarf and make money that way. But both the French courts and the UN Human Rights Commission were deaf to his pleas. They felt like it was an indignity. First of all, that it was not good for public order, that public order trumped his personal dignity. Secondly, it was undignified. And thirdly, it was in his best interest that they protect him from this indignity. So this case kind of reveals the very, very heavy hand of the court in the name of preserving dignity, rather than allowing Mr. Wackenham, the ability to choose to act in an undignified manner. The courts forced on him their understanding of dignity. Another controversy, which you might also be familiar with, again in France, is the ban, but also in other places, is the ban on face coverings, including the burqa worn by Muslim women. So the purpose of a ban on face coverings is for public safety, because face coverings make it hard to identify someone. And people, for public safety reasons, would like to be able to immediately identify people. However, governments have also argued, including President Sarkozy of France, that the burqa runs counter to women's dignity and counter to French values. These officials assume that Muslim women are forced to wear burqas and that it's demeaning to women. But the debate has never really included the voices of the Muslim women who wear the burqas and what it might signify to them. Many argue that there is no recognition or respect for their equal human dignity to choose how to enact their own conscientious observances. So like Mr. Wackenheim the dwarf, the French government takes a very paternalistic approach and enforces its own notions of what dignity is. So there are other cases that have come forward. In England, people who are disabled won a case to be able to be handled and carried in a dignified manner, to be touched in a dignified manner. As you can imagine, all over the world, anywhere where they might entertain the rights of gays, that this becomes an issue. Some countries will allow gays to marry and think of it as a human dignity right, while other countries feel like they cannot marry and will say that they cannot marry as a human dignity right.
Professor Evangeline is now accommodating questions from our audience. You may personally approach the microphone, which can be found in front of us, or you may personally write your questions in a piece of paper, give it to your classmates, and let them address the question to our guest speaker. Thank you. Any questions?
I think I've been talking a long time. Maybe everyone's tired. Okay.
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening.
You started your lecture by quoting Global Dignity, which said that in a world where there is so much division, dignity is something that everyone can agree on. Ma'am, my question is, in this world of diversity that we live in, wherein we have different cultures, different norms, we are different types of people, where do you think is our middle point? Or where do you think is the point where we agree upon that we can say that, yes, dignity is this one thing? So where do you think is it?
I don't think dignity will ever be defined. And one thing I neglected to say is that when they wrote the Universal Declaration of Rights, they actually chose the word dignity because the definition was ambiguous. And everyone could agree that dignity was a good word to use, but no one agreed on the definition. And so they made the decision to use it purposefully because it was ambiguous, and yet everyone agreed that it was the most basic thing. So, you know, I think I might agree that it might be problematic to try to use it as a concept in the law, because I think we will find a lot of contradictions down the line because it's so amorphous. At the same time, I think it's a really important thing to keep it in mind. And like I said, for me, it's all about the relationship that you have with your client. So there have been instances when lawyers have lost cases and lost their client's case. But the client feels whole because of the interaction they've had with either the lawyer, the judge, a probation officer, someone. And for that reason, because they felt recognized and their voice was heard, they have felt honored by the legal system, even when they lose. And so that's why I suggest that, in fact, it's about our ability to hear the real stories and translate real stories into law that will enhance the dignity of all of us.
Follow-up question, ma'am.
Okay.
Because I noticed in your discussion in the history of dignity in the legal sense that nobody really defined the word. So, do you agree that the elements or the characteristics of dignity change over time and in different places, in different cultures?
I do think that that is the way it's seen in the law, that it's seen that the current definition will be seen as the current culture. So, for instance, in England, believe it or not, there is still a law that says that a man can never rape his wife. That a husband can never rape his wife. That is the law on the books. Over time, that case there have been a lot of exceptions to the case, but the case was never overturned. It was a case from like the 1700s. So one day, a man who made love to his wife by knife point because she wanted to leave him, he was arrested and charged with rape, and he was convicted. And he took his case through the English legal system and then to the international human rights system to say, you can't convict me of rape because there was no law. You know, you can't kind of retroactively convict me of rape when at the time I had sex with her, I couldn't rape her. That's what the law said. And what the courts decided is that because, one, they decided that the recent cases had kind of chopped away at that holding so that it was really gutted, even though there was no case that overturned it directly. But the other thing it said is that, you know, in this day and age, people know that you can rape your wife. And that the culture of our day respects women in a different way. And so life is different today, and therefore we're going to honor this case. So I do think it's based on the culture of the time. At the same time that I think that what remains constant is this notion that there is something intrinsic about us that gives us dignity. And again, I think, you know, this is going to come into when we start thinking about bioethics, when we start cloning people, you know, when we start doing all those things, it's all going to come up. You know, what really is human dignity will be argued and litigated, I assume. Does that make sense?
Ma'am, you mentioned that dignity really has this element of being intrinsic. Do you think that an individual should have this right of personal assessment on whether what he or she is doing is dignified for himself, or do you think that there should be an external element that should identify if what he or she is doing is dignified, or is it a little bit of both?
So this goes back to the dignity stories and actually thinking of your own stories. You know, if I were teaching a class here, I often have students in the very first class write about their journey to law school and what brought them here. And it's the personal stories, you know, and oftentimes when you write it, you come up with patterns in your life that you didn't notice before about what actually brought you to law school. So I think that through stories and through kind of understanding the story of your life, you make meaning. And you can choose, like I did earlier, you know, to make meaning one way or to make meaning another way. And I don't think that the jury is ever, ever comes back with a final decision when it comes to your life. You know, that it is constantly evolving. And right now, you may think that something you did in the past was completely undignified. But later, you may find that it was because that happened that you learned something else even more important that you would never have learned if you hadn't had that experience. So I think, again, it is about making meaning. Stevens can decide that he's a failure and then just hole up and die. Or he can decide there is more to his life than that, and that he can continue to make meaning of his life and his employer's life. And so I think that, you know, that's, it's not only something we should do as individuals, I think it is actually what the law does as well, is we make meaning of stories, and then we codify it. And we should be making better stories.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Do we have any more questions for our guest speaker? Classmates? We have one. From the first year. third year, I'm sorry.
Good for you.
Good evening, ma'am. I have a 3-year-old son, and someday I know he will ask me, Mom, what is dignity? So I'd like to ask you, how best should we teach dignity or explain dignity to children?
To children.
Yes, that will be really, really hard.
It is with children that I find myself in the most undignified situations. Maybe that's what their job is to actually test us. You know, I suppose I would say the same thing. I don't think I do this as a mother myself because I get too kind of caught up in the moment. But in law, how I would think about it is how we train people to interview and counsel clients. And I think a lot of times we don't train people. And so people have this notion of what a lawyer is supposed to be. A lawyer is supposed to know everything. A lawyer is supposed to kind of look at a client's situation and tell them what the best options are. And I would argue that that's not what a lawyer does. That a lawyer actually interviews a client, studies the law and gives the client options, but that it's always the client's decision. And even when the client makes a decision, for instance, in a criminal case, maybe the client wants to plead out and go to jail. Even when the client, and the lawyer knows that he can win the case and get the guy off, even when the client makes the decision that the lawyer thinks is not in their best interest, you enhance, I think, you empower them by listening to them and trying to understand what piece of their decision or what piece of them is driving their decision. Because maybe then you can take that piece and make the law deal with it rather than, you know, just having a person succumb to whatever the law is. So you know, it's a little bit about listening. I mean, you can really, I think you really can train people to kind of approach others in a different way than we traditionally do as lawyers. Does that make sense? So if I would do the same with my daughter, but I don't have the time. I have the time, I would just say, no, you can't do that, and here's why. You got to follow my rules. But it's always a challenge, and I think a better mother would actually give that space to hear their children. I think that would be the best way, you know, for children is really to let them know you hear them and somehow manifest that at the same time that you can still hold your rules, you know, the limitations that you hold as a parent.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Do we have any more questions? We have one, last one. Let's accommodate this last one question. A representative from the first year.
Okay. From our Code of Professional Responsibility, Canon 7, a lawyer shall at all times uphold the integrity and dignity of the legal profession. Can you please enlighten us about the relationship of integrity and dignity? Thank you.
You know, I think in some ways integrity is easier because integrity is a little bit about consistency and, you know, keeping something whole, you know, integrated. So at least I have a clearer definition of that than I do of dignity. I link dignity to justice. You know, people toss around justice all the time. I think justice has no meaning, right? Because one person's justice is another person's injustice. You know, you put someone in jail for committing a crime, they may think that's completely unjust while the rest of us think it's completely just. So, so dignity really is this amorphous word that we use. And again, I'm not so sure we want to nail it down. Integrity may be a word like that as well. But I just feel like, you know, one of the things you want to do, I would think, if you're working for dignity, is to make someone more integrated and whole. And again, I think that can be done by the way you interact with them. You know, it's what psychotherapists do. You know, if you go to therapy, they try to integrate all of you into one whole. And that I think that we as legal professionals can actually act in that capacity without taking up that role. So I don't know if that answers your question. It was a nice try.
Thank you for that question. I guess that's it for our guest speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm
Thank you very
once
much.
again to Professor Evangeline S. Sarda. May I request the presence of our guest speaker here at the stage for the presentation of the Certificate of Appreciation and the giving of tokens. Here in front of me. To assist in the giving of tokens, may I call on Attorney Reynaldo U. Agranza-Mendez, the Dean of the College of Law, and Dr. Ramon C. Cercado, the President of the University of the Cordilleras. It is my great pleasure to you to read the citations of the Certificate of Recognition. University of the Cordilleras, Baguio City, Philippines, awards the Certificate of Recognition to Professor Evangeline S. Sarda, Boston College of Law, in grateful recognition for her invaluable presence as guest speaker during the Benjamin Romero Salvosa Lecture Series, Dignity in the Legal Profession, held at the University of the Cordilleras, Baguio City, Philippines, given this 30th day of June 2014. Signed, Dr. Ramon C. Cercado, President. Dignity is inherent in all of us, which means that we must give accord to every human being that we meet along the way. Hopefully you have learned something from this lecture, and may you always be dignified in all your dealings throughout your lifetime. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the Benjamin Romero Salvosa Lecture Series. Till next time, good evening.